Yeah, I also was lucky enough to be able to publish a book last year, and I'm really excited to read a little bit from that book. The book is called Firesider Rain, was published by Coach House Books in September of last year. And I'll give a bit of a background on the book and then read a few poems. So this book follows the lives of three women, a young narrator, her mother, and her grandmother. And they're all Chinese Mauritian immigrants to Southern Ontario, Southern Quebec. And it follows their lives as they sort of disperse and settle over these northern spaces. And the young narrator spends a lot of the book trying to navigate a very fractured relationship between herself and her mother and grandmother, like her matriarchal predecessors, and also trying to find her way back to her island identity. Mauritius is a small island off the coast of Madagascar. And she's trying to find her way back to that identity while also navigating those fractured relationships. And so it's about how those two searches relate to each other in different ways. So there are lots of themes that I was hoping to explore in this book, and some of those themes are island identity and the geopolitics of island identity, as well as water, which is a motif that comes back throughout the book as sort of this cyclic or this medium for the cyclic movement of people and cultures and languages, and also memories. Animals are also a motif in the book. And the first poem that I'm going to read, it's called Interred. And this poem, is about a deer. Deer come back throughout the book, as well as motifs for these women in the narrator's life who sort of morph in and out of the bodies of these animals as they move across the northern landscapes. So this first poem, as I said, is called Interred. Last week, my neighbor shot a deer at the edge of Lake Huron. And now I think perhaps sinew and muscle strings are bred to return to ash. I can't tell. If your lungs are sponge, curdling, your eyes lamplit, flickering. If you cradled me before I knew my name, do you remember where we came from? To learn your anatomy is to recite a geometric elegy as white pines unbraid themselves from trellised veins. All the quiet in the woods is coiled through your hind legs, strained inside out, siphoned through mirrors. Ghost of southern heat, half sun, half soil, no longer interred by wind leaden with ginseng, only the dissonant hush of ice and rusted car parts. WIPO's cause of death, myocardial infarction. My tender soul, if your mouth is lined with maps of forest floors, if you know the origins of sunlight, do you remember how we got here? The boy with the rifle begins to cry. He turns and runs, pulling time, a hemorrhage that leaks into 4 moments. The birth of each of his children, collecting old light. And so that was Interred. The second poem I'm going to read is called The Laws of Thermodynamics 3. The laws of thermodynamics are a set of physical laws about the ways in which energy and matter behave in the universe. It's one of those things that you learn about in school like many, many times, and you always forget what they are. At least that was what it was for me. But This poem, again, is told from the point of view of the young narrator who is finding herself in this liminal setting at the back of a Greyhound bus, driving somewhere on the 401 and exploring the sense of loneliness that those in-between settings can bring. So this poem is called The Laws of Thermodynamics 3. An isolated system possesses a natural tendency to deteriorate to increasingly disordered states over time. Mama, can you sit here with me at the back of this Greyhound, guarded from the indifference of elevators, of televisions, ECGs, sterile hallways, and white envelopes with their cold, irrefutable seals? Sit with me and slip over sandhills and snowy fields, the quiet assault of highways. Sit with me and watch tail lights trickle through southern Ontario, wobbling in the dark, a carnival of fish piping along black sand beds, bioluminous, oblivious to the great task of belonging, of being. Belonging where? Being what? The amniotic bell ponds of Pamplemousse gardens, overgrown airstrips, choked with guava, gold yellow bracts, soil carved into wavelets, kinetic, forking into this distant where. I am beset now with that usual decompression sickness, a dull measure of time past. Maman, tell me what it would mean to recognize a person with no body, no voice, no skin or tongue. When we rise with water, how will I find you again? How will I find myself again outside of these bodies which harbor an island nation so microscopic, so disposable? If one thinks of it too fondly, it may cease to exist altogether. Mama, why do we speak so little these days? Alone at the back of this Greyhound, I look over the 401 as little fires the size of moths erupt on an epithelial film of sky. Like fireworks, but not quite. Soft columns of light crisscrossing over distant roads, farms, dilapidated swing sets, telephone wires, and lakes, falling, unloading, expanding, rooting, settling, teaching, rehabilitating, bodiless. All right, so this next poem that I'm going to read is called Lessons in Southern Tides. And this poem is special because it took me probably the longest to write of all the poems in this book. And it's not even a long poem. I just felt like I reworked it so many times. And when it finally came to its resting place, I felt like a burden had lifted off my shoulders. So I'll read this one now. This poem really gives voice to that idea of water as a medium for the renewal of memory and of people. And the word alive comes back a lot in this poem because the narrator is trying to connect with that island identity of hers, but is fearful that that identity is no longer alive, that part of her has sort of atrophied. So those are the ideas that the narrator is exploring here. So, and it also takes place in two parts. The first part takes place in Mauritius, the second in Quebec. So 1, Perry-Bear, Mauritius, 1988. Does it come back alive? our slow wilt, daily routine slung over garden fences. Resist the turn of the hour. See the elderberry on gas. Let your soft thrum fingers pound black roots. Water glistens on our necks, like airplane wings blinking confessions, uniting us with our terrified, grounded selves. Until dawn comes and we salvage all we can of this latent rain. Stand here on a terraform cliff, interrogating trees. This must be alive, cradled by ocean crags. Lustrous palms whirl over tongue ansam tli. We are a caged chorus of island fires, raging on the edge of a flat-plated sea. We spent last June peeling water droplets and overripe fruit, tasting our sister islands break loose from seabeds. Barely alive, they flicker between raindrops, those lime-lit, lime coral, lime-eyed women asleep in the room upstairs. In a biotic bedtime story, does it come back alive? Virga simmering in the middle of our lives. They say the rain is wider where the women are wearier, so we assume it must be alive, all of it, in its perpetual fluidity. 2. La Salle, Quebec, 2013. Come back alive, night moth crashing through southern Quebec. In its wake, maps creak open in weed light, loosen wind belts, undulate on coastal fissures, curl into warm tile, exhale through bare soles, lie here in the shadow of this garden fence and swell, swell, recede. We've seen this before, hurtling into mind's eye. A rain-washed rhythm frayed by oil and sun, rolling with high tide, our long, charred life furled into a solitary sea wave, tapering on light. How swiftly it cools, how lonesome its royal, how effortless its return. Thank you very much. I am not sure how much time that was, but that was what I had prepared. And I can see some of the comments in the chat. So thank you so much. It's so strange sometimes reading to Zoom, but it's lovely to see your comments in the chat, and thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Rhiannon. That was so beautiful. Your voice did something so calming to my nervous system. It was so wonderful to hear those poems again. And like Rhiannon mentioned at the beginning, her book, go buy it, Coach House Books. It's an amazing book. Yeah.
Thank you for the plug.
Yeah, and it's so fun to read with you. Yeah, really, really special. So next reading, I'm Mick. And this idea of the cross-pollination, with Rhiannon speaking from the side of medical care, I'm speaking from the side of lived experience of both disability and chronic illness. And I'm mostly going to be speaking about, in those realms, my experiences with ADHD and writing and what that's like. And to share, I was thinking, like, how can what best is a way to think about this interaction? And so I tried to pull some pieces that are about like thresholds, also to go with the multidisciplinary thing happening here tonight. And also quite an array of subject matter, which, as I mentioned with ADHD, is something that the brain is firing off in many directions at many times. So Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm just going to go into this first poem. A lot of these are kind of published in various journals, like CB2 or Agni, but most of what I'm reading tonight is new. And this felt like the right space to start sharing them with the world. So welcome. Protracted circadian rhythm sex is what you called it. I drag you into constantly, that's where it happened. No longer hypothetical, on the table we touch and spill, your foot on floor, our sound is weight, my flashlight lit notes. You move candles, swipe on top and wax, a matchstick. This burning almanac is my answer to your coming question this season, will it last? And that poem is about being in love and wanting to change things about yourself to make that love work, which sometimes can get a little messy. And this next one kind of takes up that same desire, but in terms of addiction. And addiction is something that many people with ADHD and autism struggle with, which in my experience is a result of when you're in the world and all of it makes it feel like your brain's incapable. You want to get out of your brain, and getting intoxicated is a really quick way that our culture teaches us to do that. Frontal lobe scored in G flat. Yesterday, I was not a genius. I saw the door, did not take it. Stayed with many fires, littling, to watch and be in red, burnt things we kept almost wanting, I said. I said not this time, darling. Keys sounding out, and the day, that. What is a wound but an encore? Famous boat ride, tattooed brothers back. Only have that one sentence left. Don't tell my exit story wrong, because leaving is a god-like art. We microdose and miss a spectral staircase into words by hand never touched. And we were talking about this as everyone was filtering in, but I grew up on the ocean, and for a long time that felt like an essential aspect of myself until I moved east and I met lakes that changed me. And I've been thinking a lot lately about how these massive ways I find my identity now, or I ground my identity now in being neurodivergent, in being gay and trans, are all things that I didn't arrive in awareness of until I was in my 20s. And so this kind of set of poems I'm about to read is about loosening your hold to something as a final or total definition, and making room for discovery in the many ways that looks. So this series is called Lake Talks, and it's after Anne Carson's The Life of Towns. Lakes are the collection of days ended into a stillness one can sample with control, mostly. But still, these are tidal bodies, and sometimes unexpected moons cut currents with no allegiance to gravity. Like the snap of a bone or a paper-thin wall, on the other side, your story told wrong, everyone laughing. Through the keyhole, her smiling eye on you. Lakes are always there, sometimes more, other times less. A wound never scarred, mythic or a turning point, you choose. August Lake. One-way exit, but entrances are many, and distance is audible without a license, which is the sound of waiting, which is the sound of afternoon, which is the sound of February, the sound next time, and the word before a promise breaking. Carson's Lake. Glass days lap the shore of dead languages. Fog smothers dawn's horizon, disappears pines ancient. Half a knuckle bone shaped against penance, you rinse out God, stitch in the universe. That jar of stones your hand engraves with characters we hike into as chasms. The night hangs blue, to read your lamp is lightning. Lake of disappointment. There was one star across from me, sitting in the borrowed rowboat. Neither of us techniqued in steering. or language. What's day like? I'm not certain. A conversation, eyes, not words. Sunrise hammered morning until I woke. Empty boat and too much light to see anything alone. Swan Lake. Dunes, towering dunes surrounded. The other side, water. An unmapped shore I'd heard of dancing and running up the dunes. I could hear this pool of movement, imagined it smell my skin. Steps and sinking by something as small as sand, frustrated wildly. The sun dropped and still all sight was sand and wildflowers. Picked a few, got one tattooed, then in silence listened to them discuss the pleasant temperatures of water I never found. And this next poem deals with memory and the physicality it provokes. Being in a neurodivergent brain, sensory elements boom at another amplitude and organize how I see and feel time. And it also, I think, working in poetry and focusing on the senses can kind of loosen us from like the idea of linear progression, that memory is like new experiences recasting past ones, generating a kind of veil between now and then, and it's like this connective tissue between times that's like always forming and reforming. And the series that's 2 parts is called You Asked About Conditions. The feel of my face, that's new. Sometimes my whole body in estuary, the color rising. A painting can be our camera for blue distance I am running. Remember the last time you walked through that forest, those leaves where I got lost on your bicycle. The clouds will always be those clouds that day I saw you under them. Part 2. The houses are glazed, shadows untethered, bedrooms and bedrooms and bedrooms, and this moment underlined one night against 97 avenues, train tracks and backyards, a wasp's nest, an orange locket, your promise not gathered, singing, 2 sighs, then smoke, our searching, our curving. This next piece is called Institutional Playground, and I feel like this title could just be kind of the title of my life. When you're like living in systems that are kind of built for like the default idea of what a person should be or interact, engage with things, there's sometimes a moment where you see someone interacting, or you see like a painting, or how someone's reacting to a painting, or how a crowd responds to a person rather than a screen. And the life camera kind of like zooms out, and things like performativity and inequity and invisible labor kind of just becomes like in focus. Sometimes it's only like a couple moments, and there's this claustrophobic feeling, but also a question of like, how am I going to make this box I'm in work for me, and like, how can I play in it, and how can this be more than what was given to me? How can I break it? And I actually wrote most of this painting. I don't know if you can see it, but there's like a painting right there of this kind of naked body curled up into a ball that I will describe in this poem. And I wrote most of it staring at that last summer. Institutional Playground. A pawn shop in competition with the Louvre. This summer's 4th time studying tableaued human lines. The ocean sometimes in position. Other times the sea is something rendered, metaphysical studio of the notebook margin, scribbling icons in pencil-tamed permanence. Paris was outside when a print of the painting Nude Youth Sitting by the Sea from 1863 found me in the gift shop. The real thing came second. Not the moment, but reproduced. Body folded, skull exhausted, onto the forearms, bent knees, clutched wrists, sealing the envelope of skin without room for any gender. Beside a student reproducing the same secret lesbian orgy in oil, history retracts into my handwriting, his easel, still untranslatable. God breaks into the library. While houseless, a person sleeps outside. Nothing hangs off me but a body. And there, the sleeping hermaphrodite, in ancient marble, digital cameras crowding her penis, peeking out, trans people dying young, while to the sculpture, tourists flock, pushing past me in my anciently bloody tea from taping my tits away, pushing past me with a thanks lady. If this name of mine is no metaphor, has my consistent fixation for particularly protruding collarbones been disguised desire for the implication of flatness? Lake mistaken for ocean because wind also makes waves, as through me bead blue body threads, pulse sea salt in the naked Parisian P-town, rolling me post-sex cigarettes, forearms of first stories like spit painted almanacs, hair frames the wanted human parts. For 20 minutes, vision needs no glass prescription. That's where we met, hibiscus red. They ask what is the emotion of hands puzzling toward thinking shapes, split into fjords. Like a posture, there are horizons self-scattering. We send devotion to who was left. The memory of silent swims, you again between pseudonyms, trading rocks, those ceramic skulls. Instead, a paper cup earful, and the house will be no hymn. And this last set I'm going to read is my last one. It's 3 sonnets. And I was in a residency working with one of my favorite writers, Eileen Miles. If you don't know them, I highly suggest their work. And they gave us a prompt to write 3 sonnets about the morning. And being in a neurodivergent brain, transition times in the day are really difficult. Like I feel like it's a crisis every day. So it was a fun challenge to write something about a time I don't want to think about. And it made me thinking about this sense of time blindness that it took me a long time to consider as like part of a disability, that like really like I don't feel time in my body and can't comprehend it. I used to set phone alarms randomly throughout the day just to try to stay in touch with it. And I think there's a feeling in these poems of just trying to chase numbers and something. And Eileen said something to me, which I really loved because I hadn't written in form in a while until about a year ago. And that forms can be a really good thing for the wrong poet. Meaning that like you try a form until you have to break it. And I think it gives license to like finding that creative container. And like what I was saying earlier, when you find you're in some sort of box and you're like, okay, how am I going to make it work for me? The first sonnet in this, I like tried to plot out enough of the words, but there's lots of holes in it. And that ended up feeling really true to my experience too, and of time. Yeah. So thanks for listening so much. It is so great to gather and talk about this intersection that is so rarely discussed, but I know so commonly experienced on both ends of the spectrum of giving and receiving care. And I'm so fortunate to be a part of this space. Obeyed sonnets. With bad calculations, my eyes at last slice not wide, stolen time. Day already squeezing in disguise what was night of my rings, sliding, shine, improv of, starting, sunlight, expensive seeds, and I did the dishes. Nobody knows. Last night's inheritance, like belly superstitions, begin morning worlds spread before my hands, and nobody notices a butter knife in the kneecap of Proust. The A-frame closes, sky leakings before it'll all shake. Day, I'll be here, I'll take. 2. The closest I've come to routine is the event of you. In my morning bed, meaning I'm making eggs. Toasted bread on a tray, bringing it up to give you something like a kid. I'm counting time badly this early. I'm not ready for anyone else's voice but that bird and yours and the one in my head rewriting our circadian rhythms into rhymes. We get up at the same time thanks to embodied calculations, almost like I never failed high school math. It shines your face, and I know we are not an equation. Addition and subtraction is more for the king-size bed next time I'll buy to be your California trans king, and the coffee's ready when you are. 3. Curators and children without salaries understand it best, my mornings. The kind of thing you write on a bathroom floor, my clothes spelling costume, uniform. I want more than 2 options, but I'm good at all body. Improv requires a yes and policy, which is why I set a symphony of alarms for those silent 3 minutes in between. Spread before me, a bird is calling. Shiny interruptions in sounds not mine. You're mine. You said I could call you, so I wrote you a song. Because the shower is an excuse for first thinkings, and tomorrow I'll get there, not yet, but soon. I'm running out of morning quick without the irrelevance of shoes. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, both to you, Mick and Rhiannon. There's so many lines that really struck me. Rhiannon, I think the one about the long charred life, and then in Mick, you were writing about the wound as an encore. Something about that seemed like they just flowed together so well. And speaking of flow, there was just so much imagery about water that I think really tied together. So we're going to move into the kind of moderated discussion. So I have a bunch of questions prepared, but also it would be helpful if folks from the audience, if you have questions, if you kind of signal either that you do have a question, or you can write the question in the chat, just so I can, like, I don't have to go through all the questions I have, and I want to make sure we have time for any of your questions as well. So that'll just help me gauge timing. But I'll start with my first question, just building off of what Mick, you were just talking about with the form of the sonnet, and ask more broadly about if you can talk about the form of poetry. So I'm thinking about its form perhaps as in contrast to some kind of more narrative, linear form of writing, for example, and how that maybe informs your experiences or reflects your experiences. And maybe we'll start with Rhiannon, and then we'll do Mick, and then for each question we'll just kind of alternate who starts, because I know there's always this awkward, like, I don't know, who should they answer first?
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. And before I go and answer that question, just thank you so much, Mick, for those poems and that reading. So many images that just stick in your brain. So thank you. So the form of poetry, I have a couple of thoughts. I think what draws me to poetry as a medium is not only it's like it's so flexible as a form, but I think there's also a lot of silence in poetry that really draws me. There's when you look at a poem, oftentimes there's more blank space on the page than there are words. And I think in poetry, what remains unwritten is almost just as loud or as important as what is written tangibly on the page. And the poet and writer Dionne Brand, she articulates this really eloquently, this idea when she says that what is unwritten actually multiplies. And I think that that's a really important idea when it comes to caring for other people, especially with in healthcare settings. I think our healthcare system is not built to acknowledge all that is unwritten or unsaid about a person, about a patient who comes in. And I think it's kind of like in poetry, where the silence is an invitation to the reader to do work. It's really important that healthcare providers are ready to do the work to uncover what would otherwise go unvoiced about this whole person who is in front of you. And when we say like that what is unsaid or unwritten will multiply, I think when we're talking about care, when there are things that go unsaid or experiences that we don't necessarily give the chance to give voice to, that will multiply, and it'll weigh on the quality of care and the relationship between patient and provider. So we really have to pay attention to the silence. And I like to think about those parallels between writing and, or between poetry rather, and yeah, hopefully in future being a physician.
Thank
And
you, and Mick.
yeah, and kind of building off what you said about like silence and space between. From the other end, I was first drawn to poetry as a kid because of there being less words on the page and it meaning then translating for my like dopamine needing brain. That was like an undiagnosed ADHD brain, and then turning the pages faster. So I was like getting this hit. And eventually that like was able to build a muscle in me that meant I could move on to like reading more narrative stuff. But it was like the first thing I was drawn to, for like that very reason, that there was more space. And then that kind of translated into my experience of writing poetry too, because I like to think of poetry as like an interruptible form in writing. Like I start, I put it down, someone comes into the room, like the light comes in, your dog barks, and like that all is like becomes part of the poem too. And in that sense, there's this like non-theological element to poetry that for people that are not thinking in maybe neurotypical ways, I think is really expansive. You have like your narrative that is maybe more of like a normative structure, and poetry, just like you were saying, Rhiannon has this room for people to pour parts of themselves into. And I think also so much of poetics being perched on sensory impressions for people with neurodivergent brains, your sensory capacities are working like overtime. And so like for me, even though poetry is not telling you something directly, typically, it was like the first time I saw the way my brain works represented, because it was like a broken down language and it was working with impressions and things weren't always connected. And there was like images and phrases put beside each other, but there wasn't this meeting point. And that felt really true in a time when I didn't understand why I couldn't find like a connected thought and think in sentences like I knew my friends were experiencing. And I also think that poetry is so much about these repeated systems. And I think ADHD is has you like looking for the world for these patterns and pattern making. And so finding that in poetry feels extremely rewarding, because it feels like a reflection that is so distilled to that experience of looking out into the world and looking for those patterns.
Wow. Those two answers were like so phenomenal and got me like thinking in so many places. So thank you so much. The next question I want to ask about is a bit more like, I guess, a practical question. But for Mick, I know that living with and managing someone's chronic illness and disability, and I speak as someone with also lived experience of that, can be honestly like a full-time job sometimes. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how you manage writing with, are there periods where, you know, illness is flaring or managing illness is top of mind and you can't write, or does that actually fuel writing? Is writing kind of, yeah, what is the relationship? And then the kind of similar question for Rhiannon is going to be, medical training is also like really time consuming, exhausting, not just in terms of time, but energy, like just headspace. And I know especially the transition into it, again, having lived that is really hard. So even as you've been going into medicine, if you find yourself, you've been able to write poetry during this time, or if it's fueling more poetry, if it's getting in the way of being a poet. So I'll start with Mick this time, and then we'll go to Rhiannon, and we'll keep flip-flopping.
No, that's a great question. And for me, I think before I had language for what was happening, like why I couldn't have sustained focus, why like I had so many ideas firing off at once, and things like that to do with neurodivergency. And then for me, like my experience of chronic illness is like autoimmune. things that were also like my neurodivergency diagnosed later in life. So I've spent the majority of my life not knowing what was wrong. So you feel like your body's betraying you. And when you feel that, it's very hard to feel motivated. But since gaining like language around the different ways my brain and body operates, it has like pivoted into writing, becoming a channel to speak to things that will never be translatable. I think that living with chronic illnesses and living with disability are things that you talk to your other friends who have akin experiences, but it's never the same. And it's always this feeling of like untranslatability. But I feel like poetry is actually great for that, because from most of the poets, I've heard speak about their practice, like it's the life practice is always trying to translate this feeling, this thought, this impression, and it never is exact. And like you're always writing towards these feelings, these places that in the end will be like untranslatable. But then there's this kind of like calmness and just like picking away at it. So yeah, to answer your question, like before I had language from being diagnosed, it was really challenging because I felt like I took like value judgments against myself, thinking like I'm a failure, I'm not motivated, XYZ. And that's like not a place you can really write from, or at least it wasn't a place for me. But yeah, like learning it like feels so simple, saying just like accommodating yourself, but it really is like a whole journey of like learning how to do that and like proving to yourself that like you are worth building other ways around things, which then has made it so I can express these things that I don't feel like I can talk about elsewhere in my writing.
I really like that idea, Mick, of poetry as a channel for giving voice to untranslatable experiences or feelings or thoughts. And I really resonate with that. I would say, to answer your question, Miriam, I haven't been writing very much in school and during the training so far. And I'm not sure I can really see myself doing that. I have a friend who is a poet and who recently said that for her, poetry is a way of making real these peripheral thoughts and experiences that exist on the edge of her consciousness, and then putting those things into poems and using those poems as sort of a window through which to experience the world or interrogate it. And for me, I think so far, my experiences in medicine have already been very real, and I don't think that that poetry is the tool that I would use to reflect on those experiences. It doesn't feel like the right tool at this point, and maybe that'll change further down the line. But it hasn't been something that I've really pursued. And I'm sure that lots of my reflections and experiences that I have during medical training will eventually translate into poetry, but I'm not sure in what way. And it's all still very new. I'm just a first year student, so I also feel like there's a lot ahead, and we'll see.
Thank you. And yeah, just not to harp on it, but like not saying that just because I actually think there's a lot of value in hearing from people who we so often hear about people's thoughts and reflections when they're like at the end of a career. They've published all their books of poetry, and now they're going to reflect on their entire body of writing. And so I think being like in the here and now is a really valuable perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually going to go a bit rogue because I did give Rhiannon and Mick the questions in advance, but I'm going to ask a question that I hadn't exactly asked, but I really want to ask now. And it's, how do you feel that being a poet informs, so for Rhiannon, the way you're approaching what you're learning in medicine working with patients even in this early stage. And for Mick, I really love how you've talked about how your neurodivergence kind of informs your poetic, like comes out in your poetic practice and in your work. But if poetry at all kind of transforms your neurodivergent experience and also like experience with autoimmune, chronic illness. So we'll start with Rhiannon.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's definitely been interesting having been I started writing at the beginning of the pandemic more seriously, and it was quite an isolating time. But because I had started writing and I started submitting my work to journals and I started finding this community, I think I discovered and I experienced the way that art can really lead you to communities. And for myself, I found a queer community. I found community in the Chinese Mauritian diaspora, which is where half of my family is from. And that idea that art can lead you to these spaces where you can connect with people, these really like healing spaces, I think is something that is just going to follow me through my career in medicine, and something I'm going to be keeping in mind a lot when I interact with patients. And that's obviously not like a new idea by any means, just like the radical potential of connection that comes from art, and also the healing potential that comes from art and art making, or consuming art. I don't love that word, but you know what I mean. So yeah, I would say that community aspect of poetry making and art making is very much translatable to working with people and working with patients.
I really feel you on that community note, that like bringing to this like collectivity. And again, like I feel like poetry is really having a good renaissance right now, where people are like, it's cool to be a poet. But I feel like 6 years ago, you still felt kind of like, I don't know, I felt kind of silly, but I was like, I'm down to be in this like pathetically casted mode that is so feeling based. But in doing that, like in sense of any otherness, like you find other people who see and speak and like want to hold space in similar ways. And that definitely has been true to me. I like had a weird thing where like suddenly I just noticed like around the same time that I got diagnosed with ADHD, I found out like a lot of my new close friends also were coming from that experience. And so it like led there. But I think my answer for like how maybe like neurodivergence and kind of like getting into it, because like I feel like processing disability is like something that is full of grief, but also in the same way I felt about like coming out and being queer and being trans, it's also like totally liberating, because like you kind of are allowed to escape some of these punishing norms that are like made to discipline our behavior. And something like that was that I also went to McGill for my undergrad, and I was studying literature, and it was very like classic canon formal training. And for me, that was very difficult to like write things that are very planned out. And once after like researching more, after being like getting into ADHD, I like learned about like bottom up thinking, and that like literally an ADHD brain, just like the frontal lobe is not sending off those neurons in the same way your neurotypical brain is. And so these details are going to be gathered before you can see this connective tissue. And so that was a way to like write and approach work that I felt like I didn't have permission to take. But then in thinking about this is just like how my brain puts images and feelings and thoughts together, and allowing that to guide my process, I have found so much joy, and feeling like these things that felt more towards an edge of like untranslatability come into a place where I feel I can represent something of it. In that I've started to move away from a super editing process and towards more writing more and then just like cutting out things and letting those impressions, which I think are how my brain expresses like itself best, really gain solid ground in my process and like giving really like, it sounds like it's an overword used in poetry, but like a sacred space for letting that process part of just before seeing the whole picture, letting it be informed by these small moments. And then you get these moments of synchronicity. And that's one of my favorite feelings of writing, whether it be like in the actual act of writing that poem or in like the thing you're reading, informing your writing, and then your friend also read something that was by the student of that writer, and then you saw a tree that somehow makes you think of all of that. And yeah, so I think going for that bottom-up thinking and allowing for space and difference in how you approach your work has transformed my poetics in a huge way.
Wow, that's like so interesting to hear about. I love hearing about how people's approach their work. And Rhiannon, I love like the community is really, I think, a big thing. And that's what I love so much about this Cross-Pollinations community as well. I know we're getting close. We just passed 7, but I have one more question I'd love to ask, but I also, if anybody in the audience wants to ask a question, I haven't seen anything in the chat, which is totally fine. I know end of the day, a lot of folks just want to be able to engage by listening, but if you want to raise your hand, you're welcome to. And if you need to head out, please feel free to do so as well. But the last thing I want to talk about is something that's been coming out in both of your work, but I just want to explicitly, name it and talk about it, which is for Mick, about transness, about queerness, and how that you think intersects with the kind of chronic illness disability experience and poetry. And then for Rhiannon, as you named, like Chinese Mauritian diaspora, I think like migration, race, and also queerness, and how that kind of talk about that with your poetry. And also I have a feeling probably relates to kind of community and care as you're like thinking about the kind of career you want to have. So we'll start with Nick and then we'll bounce back to Rhiannon.
Well, when you think about like transness and the medical system, like there's so many upsetting things you could talk about, but I want to talk about trans joy, which is there is like so many barriers set up to like accessing care in gender affirming sense. But I find this, what we're speaking to, this like this leaning towards collectivity in that I have like found amazing medical care through my other trans friends and community who were all trying to get each other to those places that they know they can be seen and heard, and like not feeling like your transness is part of the medical part of the experience. Like that's just not on the table in that sense. And so in that sense, I think that it's like this, for me, trans community has become like an active way in like my physical becoming. And often I think about it in this, creative, political, like social becoming. But there really is like such a hands-on thing of being in like queer and trans communities about like making sure people, or trying to make sure your community can access the care that's going to make the difference. And that's what I write about so much. Just that ever-changing, that always leaving room for surprises in yourself. And the more I write to it, the more I am grounded in my sense that that's not something that happens in a vacuum. It's like we are all informing each other's many selves, because none of us have one. And it's amazing to see what that can do, coming from an experience where for me, I like dissociated for most of my life. in both the sense of I was dissociating from my body, feeling these unnamed trans feelings. And then from my mind, I was just trying to tune things out because it wasn't responding in these measures of production that most of like education and work systems and writing is structured around. But then in finding belonging in my transness, like that has healed so much of that inclination to dissociate. And in learning and having education around neurodivergency, I've learned how to bring pleasure back to writing because I am okay in writing in other ways. And I think it brings out so many fluid forms of knowing, and that intersection, like I couldn't live without now those things. They just fuel so much of my creative spirit, and I'm so grateful to be in these realms that I think are really like portals. And when you welcome them in and become less rigid in your application of like these things we've inherited of shoulds, and you got to do it this way, then there's like endless play, and that's the kind of utopic queer like philosophy that I like to work towards, that queer utopia is never going to be here, that neurodivergent utopia is never going to be there, but if we're pushing towards something collectively, that is on the horizon, and that's what's important to me. And yeah, finding the joy in failing systems has been the most liberating thing of my life so far, and I can't wait to keep doing that.
I won't add too much, I don't think, because that was such a thoughtful and like rigorous answer. Finding the joy in failing systems is a really like that's a good idea, a good line to remember. I think, yeah, I like to think of kind of like what you were saying, Mick. Poetry as like when you write poems, they kind of act as little footlights, and you follow them and you find people, you find community, you find the people there who, and also those circles of care, especially when those identities, when your identities are marginalized. And I think for myself, thinking about the future and thinking about what I want to, what sort of a physician I want to be, I think it's going to be really important to remember to work with people who are outside, who exist outside of the traditional healthcare system, and work with people who are doing active healing outside of that institution. So community organizers, patients themselves, artists, and I think, like I said before, I don't think this is like directly answering your question, Miriam, but I think those little pockets of communities who are looking out for each other and caring for each other, and holding the greater system accountable are everywhere, and you can find them through art in really unexpected ways.
I love this. I love like coming back to community always as the grounding.